Hello everyone, Derek Johnson with Tatango.com. Today we are answering TCPA questions from the internet. Thankfully I have a TCPA attorney to answer these questions, David Carter. Hey David, how you doing?
Good, thanks. Good to be here.
Okay, this one is a very specific one and very timely. It is very specific. So Justice Kavanaugh, he is the new Supreme Court Justice, which just got, he just got
Confirmed.
I was like, he just got confirmed. And I didn't even know that he could have an influence on the future of the TCPA, because the TCPA is all about text message marketing. But the question is, how can Justice Kavanaugh influence the future of the TCPA? Like, what should brands that are doing TCP or doing text message marketing, why would they care what a Supreme Court who the Supreme Court Justice is?
Yeah, so I think what's to me interesting about the current makeup of the court with Justice Kavanaugh is, we hear a lot about the fact that it's kind of shifted the court a little bit more in a conservative nature, but from a TCPA and regulatory perspective, what Justice Kavanaugh brings to the court is a belief, which he's written quite a bit about, that courts should not defer as frequently to regulatory agencies as they do in interpreting laws.
Okay.
And so if you think about it from this perspective, the Federal Communications Commission under the TCPA is charged with interpreting the TCPA and what it means and how to apply it to businesses. Mm-hmm. In the course of just the past few years, we have seen pretty dramatic changes in the scope of the TCPA. Particularly under the last administration, we saw a very broad interpretation of the TCPA where it now would apply to a lot of companies doing text message marketing, where other interpretations in the past had not interpreted it so broadly. And the reason now that we have also at the FCC under the current administration an entire proceeding to potentially reverse that decision and narrow the scope of the TCPA is because the current structure of how the courts look at these things, it gives agencies this discretion to interpret, one administration to interpret the TCPA broadly, and then we come back to another administration and they want to interpret the definitions more narrowly. And so we have this structure right now in the court system and at the federal regulatory agencies in which the agencies inherently retain this discretion. And so a statute that hasn't changed, the words in the statute haven't changed.
The TCPA.
And since 1991,
Okay.
right? It was written in 1991 by Congress. That hasn't changed. But what has changed is different administrations looking at the statute and interpreting the words in different ways, stretching it to reach a lot more companies this year, narrowing it next year to reach less companies. Okay. And so we have, in respect, this accordion effect where because of this deference that the agencies are given, the TCPA remains unsettled. Okay. We're in 1990. It was written in 1991. We're here in 2018, and you would think by now companies would know and have some level of certainty about, am I subject to the TCPA?
Yeah.
What does it mean for me? How does it apply?
Black and white, just easy.
Instead, we have these constant changes that make it really difficult, I'm sure, for you as a company and the brands that you serve to really know what's expected of them. And so why Justice Kavanaugh over time may change that dynamic that we have right now is because increasingly conservative justices, we have, Justice Alito has spoken about this. The late Justice Scalia wrote extensively about it, and we have now, Roberts and of course Kavanaugh coming in and saying maybe we need to rethink this. Should we allow agencies should courts continue to defer to agencies every time something is slightly vague, and one time the agency wants to interpret it this way, a few years later with a different political administration, they want to interpret it in a different way, and it creates and kind of continues this level of uncertainty for people that are supposed to be complying with the statute. And so what we could see is a shift in precedent, which would be a really historic shift, not just for the TCPA, but for administrative and agency law across the nation, where courts stop deferring to these federal regulatory agencies as much, and instead kind of say, you got to get to the best interpretation, and once you've gotten to that best interpretation, you need to stick with it. Okay. And it can't be a political whim where the words have never changed, but they always mean different things to different people. And so that is a possibility. It's there's two doctrines for legal scholars. There's something called Chevron deference. There's something called Auer deference, and they give different instructions for courts in terms of if it's a regulation versus a statute, some really technical stuff. But what we may see is a shifting or modification of these deference doctrines that would have courts stop deferring to the agencies, and it would help to bring a lot, I believe, that over time we would get to a level of greater certainty. And so that companies particularly, and I think this is particularly difficult for technology companies, because they're oftentimes the technology is ahead of the regulations, and they're developing and creating new technology thinking they know whether the legal restrictions apply or don't apply. But to have that kind of constant change in flux really makes it difficult for technology companies to know how to build their businesses. And so I do think that there is some potential that Kavanaugh could be a decisive vote on this issue, and that it could bring change to the TCPA in the future.
But it's a very roundabout, like he's not going to come out and say text messaging now, not that. Yeah. It's the fact that he's essentially going to say that courts should not defer to these government agencies as much. And because he says that, the TCPA is one of those things that is managed by a government agency.
Right.
Do you think he's even thinking about the TCPA when he...
Well, I mean, he has taken up, when he was at the Court of Appeals, he did, in fact, write a decision reviewing an FCC decision on the TCPA. So I can tell you that he is familiar with the TCPA. He understands kind of the implications of the TCPA in terms of its uncapped statutory damages and things like that. And he's certainly familiar, coming particularly from the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, which handles so many administrative agency appeals in D.C. He's very familiar with the fact that the FCC governs this type of technology, and that the FCC has this sort of pattern of shifting direction on some of these kind of critical or core issues that control or really dictate whether companies have to comply with the particular laws. So I think he's, in particular, very tuned in to the role of the FCC and how the interaction between the FCC and the courts impacts real businesses in the real world. I do think he's pretty tuned into that.
Just shows everything has an impact on everything else, no matter what.
And I think, in general, right, you're always looking at the where the law is today, and then how the other branches of government influence how the law gets interpreted, and ultimately what the law will be tomorrow. And this is one of those situations that could have, from a legal scholar perspective, a disproportionate impact on how agencies make decisions and interpret the law in the future.
And that'll be across all agencies.
All agencies,
so it's not just the TCPA.
Not just the TCPA, no, absolutely.
Yeah, it is very interesting, very specific question. Obviously, now I know why. Again, we are answering TCPA questions from the internet. This one was a very specific question. Has Justice Kavanaugh, or can Justice Kavanaugh influence the future of the TCPA? And it does sound like he could. Which is crazy because it's just so disconnected. But as we know, everything in DC is connected.
Everything is connected, right,
in the United States. Again, thank God I have a TCPA attorney here to help me with all this stuff. This is David Carter, a known TCPA attorney. My name is Derek Johnson with Tatango.com. And again, we're answering your TCPA questions.